Hello my friends, it is Kendra, and today we are going to be talking about all things bread. Now I am very much a beginner when it comes to bread and especially sourdough. I made this starter here and there's some nice bubbles on top, so we're going to be baking some bread today. I will be sharing the exact measurements that I am using to make my dough here, but first I want to talk about how I got into bread making. So I was inspired to start by Therese, and if you don't know who she is, I'll link her channel down below. But she is a mom of 5 and another YouTuber, and she talks about all things homemaking, minimalism. She has inspired me to learn how to make a good loaf of bread. So this morning I am starting off with a classic standard loaf, and it's going to be a little bit on the sweet side, not overly sweet, but I'm also going to be making some sweet rolls. Now here in this bowl I have started to combine all the ingredients, and I started with 130 grams of my bubbly starter. I'm also going to be adding 1 packet of yeast, or about 9 grams of yeast. Now Sarah Therese doesn't do this in her standard loaf, but she did it in her quick buns. And I used this just to kind of give my starter that little boost that it needed. And I also don't have a ton of time to be letting my dough rise and ferment overnight, and I don't have a lot of time during the day. So what I did was just modified the recipe a little bit, and I added some yeast to my standard loaf just to make it rise a bit quicker, and I can get it done within like an afternoon rather than taking like a day and an overnight to make it rise and ferment. So after the yeast, I added 330 grams of water and 9 grams of salt. I mixed that up pretty well just to make sure they were well combined, and then I added 500 grams of flour. Now depending on what you are making and what your preference is, I add between 30 to 65 grams of sugar. Now in my standard loaf, I add anywhere between 30 to 45 grams depending on what kind of sweetness I'm wanting, and in my sweet rolls that I am making, I added 65 grams of cane sugar. Not granulated sugar, cane sugar. It makes it taste so yummy. This bread is just so delicious. I wish I could let you all taste it and smell it through the camera. So here I am obviously stirring up all those ingredients with this dough hook kind of spatula that I have, and even though it may seem like it's not going to combine well, just keep going. And you could also use your hands for this, that works as well. And one thing that Sarah Therese mentions is having wet hands is very, very important, I feel like, for working with this dough. It made a world of difference once I started wetting my hands and working with the dough. It just works so much better. It's just so sticky if you don't wet your hands down. So I'm mixing all the dough really, really well until it's very wet and sticky and clumpy and combined. And then we are going to be covering our dough with a dampened flour sack towel. I like to use warm water because I find this helps with the rising of the dough, and then we will set it aside in a warm spot. Now I did the same thing for this dough here, and again the amount of sugar just depends on how sweet you want your bread or your rolls and just what you're making really. So again, cover it with a damp flour sack towel and then set it in the warm spot. Mine is on my oven, and later you'll see in the afternoon I get some sunshine. And then always cleaning up the kitchen and doing dishes in between anything we're working on. Now after making 2 doughs and doing all the dishes, I think it's dab time. I do always want to remind people that you always need to check your local laws regarding cannabis before doing anything. Everyone has different tolerance levels, so only do what feels right for you and just smoke responsibly and stay safe. Now I always like to take at least an hour before stretching and folding our dough. This is what our dough is looking like after the first hour of rising, and we're going to be doing some stretching and folding. You can see this looks like a very wet and sticky dough, and that is okay. It is going to get absolutely gorgeous and beautiful and bubbly and delicious. So we are taking our time and stretching and folding, and I normally just do this until the dough feels right, and that's hard to know as a beginner, and I normally just do it when I feel like the dough really doesn't have as much stretch to it. It's getting a bit firmer, and yeah, it just won't stretch as far, and it won't stick to itself as much as it did in the beginning. So then I just form it back into a little ball shape, and I cover it back up with my damp cloth again, and we're gonna let it sit and rise for at least another hour. Now here we are after that hour of waiting, and as you can see, our dough is definitely growing bigger. It's going to get bigger and bubblier as we go along, and I normally do at least 3 different rounds of stretches and folds for each dough. You can always do more if you want to, but that's the minimum that I've done with mine. But yeah, you will see over the course of this next little bit my stretching and folding of all of my dough, and I think I will talk to you again when we are ready to shape our loaf. And here is my dough, just loving that patch of afternoon sunlight she gets from the skylight in my kitchen. Just living her best life there in the sunshine. So next we are going to be shaping our rolls and our loaf. And the first thing I do is get out my parchment paper. Always line with parchment paper, just makes it so much easier. The other thing I found really easy for my loaf is crumpling up my parchment paper and then shaping it around my loaf pan. You might also wonder what I'm doing here. I'm just taking my hand and wetting down the counter with some water. Like I said before, this is a really sticky dough, and it helps to have your hands and even your counter sometimes wet when you're working with this dough. I just found that it makes it a little bit easier. It may be different for you depending on what your countertops are made out of, but that's just what works best for me. And then here I am kind of flattening out all of that dough into a rectangle shape, and then folding it over on itself, and then kind of pulling it towards me and kind of just folding it in on itself to form that nice loaf shape. And then I'm going to be transferring it into my loaf pan, and we're going to be covering it with that dampened flour sack towel once again, and we're going to be letting it do one final rise. I am a little particular about the parchment paper here just because I don't want any of the edges to get in the way of the dough rising. I want it to be able to reach up as far as it can. Here is the dough for my sweet rolls. Look at how big and beautiful and bubbly she's gotten. Oh, I was so excited to be making these rolls. This is my first time ever making sourdough sweet rolls, and so please don't make fun of my shaping. I was just kind of doing the best I can with all the info I've seen on the internet about making rolls, and just kind of did my best. Here are the finished rolls. I could already tell that they were too close together because they were rising as I was shaping them, but I covered them once again, let them rise just a little bit more before I put them in the oven. Let my oven get nice and warm for them, and in they went. Here are my delicious looking rolls, and then it was time for the loaf to go in the oven. I waited for it to rise just a teeny bit more. I always want the top of the dough to be a little higher than the edge of the loaf pan, but once it has reached that level, you can put it in, and I bake mine for about 25 minutes. And here she is, looking nice and brown and beautiful. That crust, oh, it's amazing to me how bread just forms its own crust around itself and then just keeps the inside so nice and bubbly and warm and soft and delicious for you. So, it's so good. I remove mine from my loaf pan right away, and I very carefully take off the parchment paper. The loaf is going to be very, very hot still at this point, so when I'm touching the loaf itself, I'm still using oven mitts, but we're taking all that parchment paper off and we're gonna let it cool on the cooling rack for a long time. Oh, look at how perfect and beautiful that crust is. Oh, I just know how delicious it tastes, and I'm just so excited for you guys to maybe be able to do that too. So along with my sweet rolls, I also decided to make a delicious cinnamon and honey butter. I added like cinnamon sugar, cinnamon, and honey, all to like one stick of butter. Now, if you've ever been to Texas Roadhouse, you know, you have an idea of exactly what I'm talking about. This is really just the homemade version of Texas Roadhouse rolls, at least in my opinion. They're not quite the same, but they are the sourdough version, at least to me. Now I stirred up all of that butter and I just put it in a small jar so we could eat it with our rolls as we went. I had to do a taste test. They are so good. Look at the inside. My dog even let me know how delicious they smelled. He wanted some too. Then it was time to cut into our loaf, and I will just let you listen and enjoy the sounds of this delicious bread. So that is about it for this bread video. As you see, I'm counting here. I typically get 10 to 12 slices out of a loaf, and there she is. She's looking so good. I hope y'all enjoyed this video. I have been loving this bread making so much, and I'm so happy to share it with you. Please give this video a like and subscribe to my channel if you haven't already. I put out new videos every Tuesday, and I will see you in the next one. Bye!